Hi, everyone. My name is Yael Shecher. I'm the Senior U.S. Advocate at Refugees International. Thank you for attending the fourth of our Voices from the Border series, a series we designed to humanize, inform, and deepen policy discussions related to migration and protection along the U.S. southern border. The topic for today's event, which we are co-hosting with Amnesty International, is Missing Migrants, Humanitarianism, and Migrant Rights Defenders at the Border. It was inspired by what happened to a Guatemalan asylum seeker named Minor, who I interviewed a few months ago with my colleague, Rachel Schmidtke, as part of field research into the impact of the Remain in Mexico policy, which is one of the numerous policies the current administration has put in place, cutting off legal access to asylum at ports of entry along the southwest border. These policies have stranded and endangered asylum seekers forced to wait in Mexico, or who seek out remote points along the border to cross and ask for asylum. The policies have also led to the prosecution of humanitarians helping asylum seekers, prosecuting them as smugglers, essentially, and targeting lawyers and activists as security threats, or claiming their security threats for helping asylum seekers. Minor lived with his family, his wife, daughter, and 2 sons in Guatemala. He worked in transport, and while driving a truck carrying juice, he was targeted for extortion. He fled to the United States, arriving at the US border in June of 2019. And he was put in the Remain in Mexico program. He was meant to wait in Juarez to attend court hearings in the United States. At one point while waiting in Juarez, he was chased by men with guns. He reported this to the police, who basically brushed it off. Many of the people in the Remain in Mexico program find themselves caught up in that kind of violence. He had several court hearings, which many of the folks in Remain in Mexico do. His most recent one was in March of 2020. So mind you, he'd been waiting since last June. Right before the lockdown. That was for the pandemic. That was his last hearing. And he was sent back to Juarez for further waiting for his next hearing, which is now who knows when. He was waiting in Juarez in precarious conditions. He was living in a crowded house with 15 other men, had very insufficient access to food. Remember, this is right when the pandemic kicked in. I last spoke to him in April, and that's where things stood. Then in June, I got a message from his wife, and we have a short clip from his wife that we'll show now.
Hola, mi nombre es Rosidalia Reyes Jacinto. El motivo de este video es para solicitar ayuda para encontrar a mi esposo Minor Ezequiel Morales y Morales, que salió el día 2 de mayo de Ijonaga, Chihuahua, México, con destino hacia Dallas, Texas. La última información que tengo es que él no aguantaba caminar en el desierto y se quedó. Necesito de su ayuda para poderlo encontrar, ya que hemos investigado, hemos llamado al consulado y nos dicen que no ha sido detenido. Por favor, si me pudieran ayudar a encontrarlo.
Sorry for that slight glitch, but I think you get the point. Minor's wife basically contacted Rachel and I and told us that he had tried to cross into the United States in a relatively remote area of the border in Chihuahua, not near Juarez where we're staying, not really near any other big place in Mexico. I actually did not know what to do when I got this message. He crossed, as I said, a remote area, and he was making his way to Dallas, but we didn't know where he was left along the way. All we knew was, well, we contacted the Red Cross, and the Red Cross helped Rocio, the woman in the video, get in touch with consular officials to find out whether or not Minor was detained anywhere. So we learned that he was not detained in immigration detention, but we didn't know where to find him. And which sheriff's office should I contact, because Texas is broken down into many, many counties, and I didn't know where along the way to turn. How would I even begin to help her find Minor? And so I turned to several people on this panel, or at least one. I turned first to Stephanie Ludert, who works at the Strauss Center at the University of Texas at Austin. Stephanie actually knows quite a bit about both topics we're kind of approaching today. Last summer, Stephanie was threatened with arrest for smuggling, basically, by Mexican officials after she accompanied a Salvadoran boy to the port of entry at Eagle Pass to help him ask for asylum. But then this past spring, Stephanie also wrote a report about the death of migrants in Texas, which has now surpassed Arizona in terms of the numbers of reported migrant deaths. Arizona, however, has perhaps the longest history dealing with remote border crossings, missing migrants, the recuperation and identification of migrant remains, and efforts to help relatives find loved ones and deal with loss. We have two speakers who will speak about these efforts. Gio Del Pino will speak about the work of the Colibri Center, and Paige will speak about the work of No More Deaths, an interfaith humanitarian organization that works both to prevent the death of migrants and to deal with the death after it happens. The work of these two organizations continues in spite of the pandemic that we're in right now. Our last but not least speaker is Brian Griffey of Amnesty International, who has written extensively, researched extensively anti-asylum border policies and the targeting of rights defenders and humanitarians, including Scott Warren of No More Deaths, the protagonist in a documentary that we'll show after Brian speaks. Scott Warren's trial is reminiscent, actually, of a similar trial way back in the 1980s, in 1986, of the founder of No More Deaths, Reverend John Fife, who was found guilty of concealing undocumented migrants for providing sanctuary for asylum seekers at that time. Like migrants going missing, which certainly has been happening in large numbers since the border enforcement ratcheted up in the 1990s, the prosecution of those who provide aid to migrants is also not new, but the migrant population has shifted towards asylum seekers from Central America in recent years, and the current administration's policies have pushed these migrants to more dangerous crossings, like the Remain-in-Mexico program I mentioned before. And Attorney General Jeff Sessions ordered prosecutors to prioritize cases under the harboring statute, which is the one Scott Warren was prosecuted under. It's a kind of zero tolerance policy towards humanitarians. The prosecution of Warren occurred soon after No More Deaths released a video, as you'll see in the documentary, of Border Patrol agents spilling out water left in the desert for migrants. And that image certainly belied the projected image of the Border Patrol as rescuers of migrants, which they frequently portray themselves as. Brian will discuss this in a bit more detail and draw out implications for our moment right now. Not just a time of pandemic, but a time when DHS enforcement efforts against migrants and against activists are certainly visible far from the border in cities all across the country. After the documentary screening, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers about the presentations of all the panelists and the documentary. But please post your questions in the Zoom Q&A chat as the event proceeds, like as the panelists are speaking, so that if there's an important question or a factual clarification I can ask of any of the panelists after they speak, I'll raise it to them. We will be screening the questions as they go along, so we'll try to get in one or two questions to every panelist along the way, and then we'll have plenty of time to deal with the rest of the questions in the Q&A after the documentary. Just a heads up that the event is being recorded and we'll post it on our website in coming days. Okay, I'm now going to turn it over to our panelists. We'll each talk for about 5 or 7 minutes, starting with Stephanie. So I'll let you guys go ahead. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Yael. All right, and thank you for hosting this really important conversation on migrant deaths along the border. So my name is Stephanie Loiter, and I work at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about migrant deaths, particularly in South Texas. Now, before I get into some of the findings, I wanted to highlight particularly why I've been working on this topic for the last 2 years. And so it started 2 years ago in August 2018 when I stopped by the Brooks County Sheriff's Office. And I just stopped by to talk about regional migration dynamics and what was happening in that county. And during my time there, the sheriff pushed across the table a binder that looks a lot like the binder that you see on the left-hand side of the screen. Except that binder said 2018 human remains. And it held case after case of people who had died while trying to circumvent the Border Patrol checkpoint in Falfurrias, Texas. And there, at the time, there was 54 cases in that binder, and it grew as the year went on. And it had women and children. There were people in their 60s and 70s, some as young as 15. And they also had pictures of the things they carried on them. There were rosaries, Bibles, letters written from family members and loved ones, telephone numbers, all different types of things, reading glasses. And as I was going through the pages, it really struck me. I knew, of course, that this was something happening along the border, but it was such a huge humanitarian crisis. There was only 3.5 hours away from where I was living at the time, where I currently live in Austin, Texas. And so over the following months, I went back, and you can see in the photograph on the right, all of the binders for different years. And each of those binders has tons of files in them as well. In total, there's over 700 over the past 9 years, just in Berks County alone. And so this was my first project of really trying to record what was actually happening with migrant deaths in South Texas. And in the following months, over the past year, I've expanded that research from just one county to now 18 additional counties across South Texas. And so when I talk about South Texas, what I'm referring to is 3 Border Patrol sectors, and it's all of the counties that are highlighted in some shade of blue in this photo. All right, so I kind of went into this first. I wanted to document who these people were, but one of the biggest findings and takeaways for me has been just how much migrant deaths in South Texas are both undercounted and obscured from vision. And so there's many reasons why this is the case, but I'm going to highlight 3. The first is that many of these deaths take place on private land. The second is that there's numerous overlapping agencies that are responsible for documenting these deaths. And the third is that drowning deaths in the Rio Grande are wildly undercounted. So to start with the first one, on migrant deaths in South Texas taking place primarily on private land. If you can see in this picture, everything that is not red, black, or green is private land. 95% of the land in Texas is private. So this has enormous implications for migrant deaths. First of all, organizations such as the South Texas Human Rights Center that go out and leave water and do water drops, they can't access land that's private. They have to negotiate with ranchers to be able to get onto the land to leave their water drops and to refill water stations. If you're a journalist or a researcher, it's also difficult to be able to document these deaths because, again, you don't have access. If you want to go out and search for someone, if you want to do a grid search, you can't do that without the permission of the landowner. And this is complicated because ranchers often don't want the publicity of having so many people die on their land. And so all taken together, it creates a lack of transparency with these deaths that can really obscure the scope of just how enormous the situation is. And as Yael mentioned, in the past few years, the number of deaths in South Texas has been the highest, or it's been the highest for the whole border. And in fiscal year 2019, migrant deaths in South Texas, according to the Border Patrol, were 3 times higher than in the Arizona sector. So this is the Tucson sector in Arizona. So this is a huge humanitarian crisis that does not get enough attention. Now, another reason that migrant deaths are undercounted and obscured is that there are so many county level actors that are involved in some way. So this really crazy org chart comes from the report that we published back in May. And it covers what happens from start to finish, from when an individual passes away all the way to repatriation or burial. And what I want to draw your attention to is the shaded in bubble migrant death. And there's 2 arrows, one to Border Patrol and one to the Sheriff's Office. Now, if an individual passes away and is discovered, and that individual, the discovering party calls the Sheriff's Office, the onus is then on the Sheriff's Office to report it to Border Patrol, which publishes the data for the entire border. There are no formal agreements, at least in South Texas, linking the Border Patrol to the Sheriff's Offices. It's all working relationships. So if a Sheriff's Office does not report that death to Border Patrol, it certainly does not go into their data, and we know that that happens in certain counties quite frequently. Not to mention, even if they do report that death, it doesn't mean that the Border Patrol is going to include it because they often include only deaths where a Border Patrol agent is present. So taken together, this also creates undercounting. And third, and finally, many migrants are drowning in the Rio Grande and they're not counted in US numbers. Now, if someone drowns while crossing the Rio Grande, which is the delineating border between Mexico and the US in South Texas, whether they're in a US database or a Mexico database is going to depend on the current in that part of the river. If their body is washed to the US side, they'll be in the US database. If they're washed onto the Mexican side, it's the Mexican database. This map comes from the report that we published in May, and it's highlighting each city, each circle, or the number of deaths that we counted in Mexican border cities of migrants or people who appear to be migrants who died in the river, drowned in the river, and washed onto Mexican territory. We counted more than 300 in just the past 8 years alone. None of these figures are in US databases. Now, this includes some really high profile cases, including Oscar and Valeria Martinez from El Salvador, the father and daughter whose picture of their drowning death was shared widely across the United States and around the world. Yet this death of this father and daughter are not included in any US database because they washed up on the Matamoros on the Mexican side of the border. And so just to conclude, what are the current conditions right now in South Texas? Well, as of in 2020, in this year, migrant deaths have been lower than in previous years. And this is largely because of the lower number of people crossing because of the pandemic in the last few months. However, we know that for more than the past 100 years, we've seen that US policy, as it becomes more restrictive, increases migrant deaths. So all the way back in 1917, when you have the first restrictions on Mexican laborers and people begin crossing the river instead of walking through ports of entry, that was the first time we start ticking up drowning deaths, and it's a trend that's continued for 100 years. Which leads us to what's going on right now. As you close legal pathways and remove asylum protection, we know that this creates more deaths. And because this is the path that the current US administration has been taking, it's ensuring that there will continue to be tragic outcomes in South Texas for years to come. Hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. We didn't get quite a question, but one of the panelists asked if you might share the link to your report in the chat function. So maybe you could do that so people could have a look. That would be
Absolutely.
great. Thank you so much. Let's move on to Gia, I guess.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm very moved by that, and also moved by what's to come and what's anticipated with, the tightening of borders and pretty much eliminating asylum and what that means for our work. But before, thank you so much, Refugee International and Amnesty International, for inviting Colibri Center to participate in this really critical conversation. My name is Gia Del Pino. I'm the Program and Data Associate for Colibri. And I'd like to start this conversation by kind of discussing our origin story and why we're named Colibri, which means hummingbird in Spanish. It's based on a true story. In 2009, a man who was crossing the border died and was brought into the Office of the Medical Examiners here in Pima County. And in his pocket, they found a dead hummingbird wrapped in gauze. This is really poignant because in various cultures throughout Latin America, the hummingbird represents hope, strength, and migration. And even other cultures see it as a messenger between the living and the dead. So in order to honor this man and the many lives who are lost crossing the border, we named our center the Colibri Center for Human Rights. Our mission is to promote healing and change by working with families of disappeared migrants to identify and honor those who have died along the US-Mexico border. We work in solidarity with families of the disappeared to find truth and justice through forensic science, investigation, and community organizing. Colibri bears witness to the unjust loss of life, accompanying families in their search and holding space for families to build community, share stories, and raise awareness about this preventable human rights crisis. We focus on two main programs. First is our Missing Migrant Project and DNA program, and next is our Family Network. In 2017, we started to collect DNA samples from family members because the reality is that where migrants are crossing, it's very harsh and hostile desert environment, and they're crossing in very remote areas. And it's extremely difficult to identify families through non-genetic methods such as fingerprints or even photo comparisons. DNA is simply the greatest hope for identification for most of these cases that we're working with. And because of COVID, we're now emphasizing our mail kit program, which sends out DNA mail kit to many families across the US so they can take samples at home and then mail it back to us where we process it at a private lab. But beyond our forensic justice work, we work directly with families through the Family Network. This is a quote from one of the families who participate in the Family Network. El no saber nos está matando. The not knowing is killing us. Here we have Mirna, who's holding a photo of her son, Byron, and Angelica, who's holding a photo of her brother, Daniel, who disappeared. The Family Network reconvenes in different major cities across the US where a lot of cases are found. This is the Bay Area, this is Phoenix, this is Tucson, and this is New York. And it was born out of the expressed desire of the families to connect with others who understand this particular grief, very complicated form of grief that only those who live with uncertainty over what happened to their disappeared loved one understand. And it's a concept called ambiguous loss. So the families convene in persons once a month in these different cities. They also participate by writing poems, letters, even sharing recipes of their loved one that disappeared, their favorite recipe, through a magazine called Hermandad. These are numbers reported by Border Patrol as of 2019. As Stephanie mentioned, there is severe undercount. They report within the span of these years that 7,805 people lost their lives while crossing. And of those, at least 3,150 people died in southern Arizona. That wildly contradicts what we're seeing in our work. We started much later, and we've already seen 3,475 people reported missing to Colibri, and 1,135 sets of remains recovered in Arizona that are yet to be identified, as reported by the Office of the Medical Examiners. This is the migrant death map created by Humane Borders. They also do water drops in the desert. I just wanted to, give a visual of the 400 miles that Arizona borders with Mexico, and how far up north people migrate and where their remains are found. This is 75 miles up north. We predict that with COVID, again, our organization has also seen a decline in cases because of the pandemic and the tightening of the border, but we suspect that because entry points are being shut off using COVID as a pretext, right, that we're going to start seeing a lot more remains found and even more desolate and hostile of areas. This is our reporting and DNA process. So the families contact us. We do an extensive and thorough intake report where we get physical descriptions, circumstantial descriptions as well. So what were they wearing when they last left? Where did they leave from? Stories of their migration. Where's the last time you heard from your loved one? Details about their dental records, any prior injuries or pre-existing conditions. Once we get all that very detailed report, we start doing an initial comparison with large DNA databases. If that's been exhausted, then we request a DNA sample from a blood relative from the family. And before COVID, we would even take trips to Guatemala because there was a trend in these past years where a lot of migrants were coming from Guatemala and Central America. So we would even take trips. Of course, now we've had to shift to mail kits within the US. Once we receive a sample, we analyze that sample with a private lab. That typically takes 3 to 6 months, and it's taking longer. And that's also, a side effect of COVID impacting their work. Once a match is made, then we work with the consulates and the families to try to repatriate those remains back to their home countries. And all along this process, the family can engage with us through the family network. And many families still work with us even after they've had a response. I want to give you 2 examples of how this works and also how different these processes are. This is Camerina Santa Cruz. She's an active participant in the Tucson Family Network, and she's also a spokesperson and an advocate. She started searching for her son, Marco Antonio, back in 2013 when he disappeared trying to cross the southern Arizona border. She filed a case with Colibri 3 years later in 2016 and participated in the DNA program that same year. 2 years after, in 2018, her DNA matched positively with Marco Antonio's remains that were found in the Pima County Medical Examiner's office. That gives you kind of an overview of how long this process takes and how much suffering the family endures until they get a response, because a family ultimately never finds closure. Marco Antonio is from Nogales, Sonora, and he passed away at 35 years old. This is Felix Gomez. He was in search of his brother, Pablo Jacinto Gomez, who went missing in July 2018. Pablo's case was a little bit different. His remains were identified by physical description, so no DNA was taken. Because there was a strong enough circumstantial information. Pablo had a tattoo of his daughter's name and birthday on his hand. And with that, comparing it with the information provided in the intake form and the photos provided by the family, we were able to make a blind match relatively soon. I believe it took 6 weeks for that to happen. Pablo Gomez is from Guatemala, and he passed away 35 years old. This is a photo here of Irma Carrillo Nevares. She is the mother of Yadira and Jose. And she's in front of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights back in 2018. She spoke of the unnecessary suffering inflicted on families of disappeared migrants by the state and demanded action, asserting to representatives of the US government that every minute, every hour that you wait to make a decision that might end our suffering is keeping our lives in captivity. She brought a painting that depicts her grief. This is her heart with 2 holes punched out, which represent her two children. Los seguimos buscando, siempre presentes. We continue our search, always present. The family network comités or committees will honor their disappeared persons by setting up altars with their photos, flowers, and candles. This is a way for the families to simultaneously honor their loved ones who've passed away and provide support for those who have yet to receive news on their cases. At the end of the comité, the families will stand around the altar for a moment of silence. Some families take this time to pray, to share kind words of support, or sing happy birthday to their loved one. With that said, I would like to invite you all to join me for a moment of silence to honor the lives of all of those who've disappeared crossing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gia. That was so moving. Just one question from the audience, like a point of clarification. One audience member asked if the DNA kits are being mailed within the U.S. or to family members outside the U.S., like in Mexico or Guatemala, where their families are from.
Right now, within the U.S.
Okay, our next speaker is Paige. Would you like to go ahead, Paige?
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks again for organizing this, and thanks to everybody for participating. And it's great to hear about the work of other organizations. So thanks for allowing us to be involved. My name is Paige Korich-Klein. I have worked with No More Deaths, No Mas Muertes, for about 7 years, mostly as a volunteer with the desert aid work, doing water drops in the desert, but currently I am our media coordinator. So I've been helping with doing interviews and media around some of our court cases and the targeting of our work, and then also just helping with our social media and doing different tasks. But No More Deaths is a humanitarian aid organization based in Southern Arizona. We're mostly Tucson based, but work further south along the border. And the mission of No More Deaths is to end death and suffering along the US-Mexico border. And looks like some of the words got cut off on my slide. But our work is to prevent the deaths that Stephanie and Gia are doing work around and try to intervene in different ways that we can. And so I wanted to share the same map that Gia put up just to show the massive amount of deaths in Southern Arizona. I think what I used to really see about this map was just the massive amount of known deaths that there are. But now when I look at this map, what I actually see more is the areas where there aren't known deaths. So if you look kind of in this area right here, there's a really strong line where the deaths just stop. And the reason for that, which really builds on what Stephanie was talking about as well, is that's the county line. So that's the line between Pima County, Maricopa County, and Yuma County. And so we've been trying to get info from Yuma County, and we've gotten some reports that we've also passed along to the people that run this map, but they have not been sharing their info with different NGOs and other organizations. So there's really big gaps in our knowledge. So just wanted to kind of tag that on to what the speakers before me mentioned, because it definitely is true to our experience as well. So the ways that we try to prevent death and suffering in the desert is mostly through desert aid. So we go out to areas where people have died. A lot of these are really remote areas, they're really dry, and we try to prevent deaths by dehydration, by leaving water. We also put out food, clean socks, and then in the winter we put out blankets, because it's not just the heat that will kill people. In the winter, the temperatures drop well below freezing, and so we also try to address that and just leave supplies that we know could potentially be life-saving. We've spent the past 15 years mapping different areas, and we use a lot of those known death maps to go out and find areas that people are crossing through. But then it's a lot of trial and error. We track all the places that we leave supplies, and then we also we monitor them for vandalism as well as use, and try to prioritize areas that we're seeing more heavy use in. We also have aid stations set up, so we can provide first aid to people crossing, and just give care. We see a lot of dehydration and heat-related injuries, as well as really bad blisters from folks, and so we're able to provide medical care to people. We also have a search and rescue and recovery working group. We have a missing migrant hotline where family members can call in when they have a family member who's lost in the desert, and we're able to sometimes mobilize a search team to go out there, or advocate for law enforcement and other emergency resources to be mobilized. What we found over the years is that there's a really, there are two 911 systems in the borderlands. There's one for citizens and there's one for non-citizens. And what we've found is that there's a really discriminatory response to people calling 911 asking for help in the borderlands if they're presumed to be a border crosser. The cases are passed to Border Patrol, and then there's either a severely diminished response or no response at all. And so that's another thing we see when folks are actively know that a loved one is in the desert. Often the response is delayed or non-existent, which results in these disappearances and deaths as well. So part of our work is also responding to those calls and helping people navigate a system that was really not set up for them. We also, our group is not focused on recovery, but we do often find the remains of people who have died. Sometimes when we're just out doing water drops, or when we respond to some of those search and rescue calls, often they do turn into recoveries, because when folks don't know the area that they're in, and they're funneled into these remote areas where there's no cell coverage, sometimes we don't get enough information to locate a person before they pass away. So we often do recover the remains or find the remains of people who have died, which we then report to the sheriff to recover. And so that also kind of backs up the theories about blank spots on the map don't mean that no one's died there. It means no one's been found. And often when we go out into some of these remote areas that we've never been before, particularly the West Desert around Ajo, Arizona, we started finding that the blank spots on the map, we would go out and every single time we would go into a new area, we were finding human remains. And so that became much more of a focus of our work in the area around Ajo, was more around the recovery work. We also document abuses at the hands of Border Patrol and other law enforcement agencies in the borderlands. We've been doing that since 2008. So I really want to highlight that a lot of the abuses that we're seeing by Border Patrol are not new. They span multiple presidencies and multiple administrations, both Democrat and Republican. We started documenting abuses in 2008 and mostly looking at short-term Border Patrol custody. But we're currently working on a larger series called Disappeared, how the US border enforcement agencies are fueling a missing persons crisis. And we've already released part 1 and 2 of that report, and we're gonna release part 3 next month. Part 1 was about deadly enforcement practices, so talking about Border Patrol actively funneling people into remote corridors and then often chasing people and scattering groups intentionally so that people will become lost and disoriented, which also results in disappearance and death. And then we also came out with part 2, which was about interference with humanitarian aid. And that was based on our information about the places where we had left water and documenting really widespread destruction of that, as well as harassment of humanitarian aid workers by Border Patrol. And we also released a video that ended up going viral of agents dumping out water, kicking over gallons, and removing blankets in the winter. And just a few hours after that video went out, one of our volunteers, Dr. Scott Warren, was arrested with 2 other men from Central America named Jose and Christian, and he was charged with harboring. And so we saw that really as retaliation for the report. And then part 3 of Disappeared is going to be, is coming out next month, and it's about emergency non-response. So it's really detailing the discriminatory 911 practice, but also really focusing on Border Patrol's non-response to emergencies, and really highlighting that, you know, not only have they funneled people into these areas, they then scatter people intentionally, and then they have essentially taken over the emergency response, which they're completely failing at and not responding to. And so really just documenting the exact mechanisms that result in disappearance. And we intentionally use the word disappearance as well. This isn't just a missing persons crisis. We view it as intentional state disappearances. And we really wanted to use those words to highlight and build connections with crises of disappearances in Central and South America that have happened historically, often with US support for training death squads and secret police. Like, we view the disappearances and deaths along the border as a part of that same mechanism. So really want to highlight that piece and keep an eye out for the report next month. We also, as folks mentioned, and as the documentary that we'll look at details a bit, we have kind of seen the targeting of our organization, and we view that as an escalation in the targeting of migrant communities and immigrant communities and mixed status communities. So the fact that they're now kind of expanding the criminalization to not just be about people crossing the desert and living undocumented, now they're also targeting people who hold a lot of privilege that stand in solidarity with them. And so that's definitely a pretty significant escalation that we saw happen. But, you know, the hashtag and kind of the slogan we used was humanitarian aid is never a crime. And that's totally true. But I think a lot of us kind of in our hearts were kind of like, well, but the humanitarian aid not being a crime part doesn't really get at it, because the issue is that migration and being undocumented is criminalized, and that's the real core issue. And so really viewing the targeting of aid workers and humanitarians as an escalation but that the real core and kind of origin of it is the targeting and criminalization of migrants. This is just an expansion of that practice. So again, we had the felony charges, which I mentioned, against Scott Warren, who was eventually, the charges were dropped. And then we also had 9 volunteers, who included Scott, who were charged with misdemeanor crimes for leaving food and water in an area known as the Trail of Death. So really us trying to, through our knowledge of missing persons reports and migration patterns, we were really going to the area that we knew was in that moment one of the most deadly in Arizona, and we were, people were charged with crimes for that work. Those charges were all eventually dropped as well. Some of the volunteers had guilty verdicts that were then later reversed. But the fact that we were criminalized in the first place, we believe was just a big escalation of the targeting of migrant communities. So that's just kind of a quick rundown. There's a lot more work that Migrants does that I wasn't able to touch on, but if you want to stay connected, we're on social media. We also send out our newsletter if you want to donate. These are all of our social media handles, and we have a website as well. So please check us out and yeah, stay in touch.
Well, Paige, the question just rolled in during that. So I'm just gonna, they basically break down into 2 general types of questions. Some are about, the process, like what kind of tools do you use? Like, you use cell phones and Signal to do your work. And the other has to do with, the response of the authorities. Why isn't there a legal obligation for people, these deaths to be reported? Why is it that 911 is discriminatory? How is that legal? And then I guess last is sort of, what are your options given this scenario? So that's a lot. And how can we make aid stations more welcoming to people? Those are a lot of things, and we can address them in the Q&A. But if you want to talk a little bit about one or any of those, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I'll kind of touch on the 911 discrimination and the county legal obligation for emergency response, because I think that was a big thing that for me at first was a bit shocking, especially a lot of these deaths in the West Desert are happening on Organ Pipe National Monument or in wilderness areas that are run by Fish and Wildlife. And so my big question was, why aren't these local land managers responding to it? And as we kind of open dialogue with those land managers, they just do not see it as their responsibility. And I think the reason that it's able to exist is systemic racism and the ways in which the lives of undocumented brown people are not valued the same way that a white hiker's life would be valued. Organ Pipe National Monument is the only national park in the country that doesn't report deaths every year because they have hundreds. And they just don't report them. And it's because of the way that this country values different lives over others. And so, again, I think looking at the shock that came with Scott's arrest and current, Border Patrol being deployed in Portland, I think we should really evaluate that because undocumented communities have been raising the alarm and talking about this for decades and have been largely ignored. So I think it really has to do with just the deep, deep roots of systemic racism and white supremacy in this country.
Hard to hear, but important. There's a lot more questions, which I promised the audience that we will get to them in the Q&A. I just want to thank you very much, Paige, and sorry I botched your last name earlier. Brian, I'd like to turn to you to sort of talk about your reporting and other issues that we've raised.
Thanks so much, Yael, and thank you so much to the other panelists, including especially Paige, for building the bridge there between the denial of access to human rights of migrants and asylum seekers on the southwest border and the attacks on migrant human rights defenders and civil society more broadly. I think that's really the main juncture that I'm going to dive a little deeper into right now. But I think that as Paige framed, it was spot on that the goal of all of these border and asylum policies is not only to you know, do national security or whatever their bogus rhetoric is around these issues, but it's to push people back into harm's way. And this is in a variety of ways. It's through denial of access to asylum procedures, through denial of access to humanitarian aid to people who are in need of it, and ultimately to send people back to harm, whether it's in northern Mexico or in their countries of origin, irrespective of whether they were seeking to rejoin family members or were seeking political or other varieties of asylum, etc. And one thing that, as a human rights researcher who's worked around the world documenting human rights crises, one thing that I would say is a common denominator is that in any state where there's a deliberate campaign of human rights violations against a vulnerable group of people, in this case, people on the move, migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees, the people who jump in between the abusive government authorities and those rights holders themselves often become a primary target for abuse. And that's one thing that we've consistently seen throughout the crisis on the southwest border, particularly during this Trump administration, is the renewed and primary targeting of migrant human rights defenders, including immigration lawyers, humanitarian volunteers, and other individuals. So this first really came onto our radar in April of 2018, when there was the first of the very high profile, well, actually not even that high profile, but increasingly high profile caravans of migrants who were approaching Tijuana that was being supported by Pueblo Sin Fronteras, among other activists and organizations. And the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice both issued incredibly aggressive statements that were threatening migrant human rights defenders, in particular, activists and immigration lawyers, with criminal charges for human smuggling, essentially. It was somewhat encoded, but that's what they were saying in these statements. And we were so blown away by this that it really raised the flags on this government's intention to target migrant human rights defenders who are trying to defend the human rights of migrants and asylum seekers who are being abused by the government. And so what we also saw at that same moment in April of 2018 was the beginning of large-scale illegal pushbacks of asylum seekers at the border through the so-called metering program, under which tens of thousands of people were forced to wait in Mexico indefinitely until the U.S. government said, oh, it had space to admit new refugees. You know, granted that the numbers were actually not as high as sometimes in other administrations, but nonetheless, they said the United States government couldn't handle this many refugees. So they initiated this metering program to force people to wait in Mexico. And then one of the immediate results of this is that more people started to cross over irregularly, including unaccompanied children, families, and asylum seekers, among other people who were crossing irregularly. And so then at that point, as the Department of Homeland Security's own Office of Inspector General, as well as civil society organizations have demonstrated, the US government took advantage of this compelling of people to cross irregularly in order to then enforce its family separation program. So we see this chain reaction of abusive policies from metering and family separations, and then the targeting of migrant human rights defenders allegedly as individuals who are seeking to quote unquote smuggle migrants and asylum seekers over the border. And now this then was in April of 2018. And as the larger caravan started to arrive in November of 2018 is when Amnesty International began to be alerted by migrant human rights defenders all over the border that those initial red flags of the apparent targeting of civil society by the Trump administration had turned into a full-out campaign of surveillance and legal harassment against those individuals. So over the following months, Amnesty International documented this campaign of intimidation, threats, and legal harassment, and in some cases criminal prosecutions against migrant human rights defenders. In this report that we issued in July of last year called Saving Lives is Not a Crime, Politically Motivated Legal Harassment Against Migrant Human Rights Defenders by the USA. And I will put a link to that in the chat here for people. in case they're interested in perusing it. Now, what had begun as some intimidating legal statements then turned into a secret watch list that was later revealed, that was being maintained by the Department of Homeland Security, tracking dozens of migrant human rights defenders, immigration lawyers, activists, journalists who were reporting on migration issues, and this watch list that was later leaked by an ICE Homeland Security investigations official who wanted to draw attention to it because of the lawlessness of this list. People were having, they were being detained for up to 6, 7, 8 hours at a time, handcuffed to metal benches. They were having their electronic devices searched, etc. And then ultimately, in some cases, were also being criminally investigated under human smuggling charges. This was not the only phenomenon of this, though, but what we learned was that the government was trying to utilize human smuggling, an obscure human smuggling provision that criminalized inducing or encouraging people to violate U.S. asylum law in order to target migrant human rights defenders. At the same time, individuals in Arizona who were approaching the border with asylum seekers were being detained and threatened with arrest for so-called aiding and abetting of human smuggling, even just for trying to do legal observation as they approach the border. So then this is all in tandem with the cases of No More Deaths, Paige already outlined, of people being prosecuted for human smuggling and conspiracy to transport migrants and asylum seekers simply by trying to provide the life-saving aid that the US and Mexican governments were not providing. To zoom out, what we see here in the big picture is that both the US and Mexican governments are denying people their right to seek asylum at the border, pushing them into harm's way, including making them cross irregularly, and then denying them humanitarian aid, which is increasing the likelihood of their deprivation of the right to life on the border, and then targeting those who are seeking to assist them through humanitarian aid, through legal representation, or otherwise with criminal charges merely for supporting them. So the provision under which the DHS had assembled this illegal watch list of migrant human rights defenders ended up getting heard before the Supreme Court earlier this year. And one of the unfortunate developments since then is that whereas the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals had found this to be an overbroad violation of the First Amendment, constitutional protections of the views and speech of people who may be so-called encouraging or inducing people to cross the border irregularly, the Supreme Court said that the Ninth Circuit had overstepped in making this determination, so they sent it back. So this provision now is still in the books. And this is one of the things I want to highlight now in terms of the parallels, as Paige also noted, between migrant human rights defenders on the border and what's happening in the interior. Is that as the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals found, as the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals found in its decision in December of 2018, this unconstitutionally overbroad criminal provision that criminalizes people encouraging or inducing people to stay in the U.S. contrary to immigration law could be used even to target, a grandmother who doesn't want her undocumented child or vice versa to leave and go back to their country of origin, or a social service worker, or a lawyer who's providing options to people who are undocumented in the U.S. And this is at a moment right now when, as some may recall, in June of 2019 last year, the Trump administration had indicated, in fact, Donald Trump himself said, that they planned to identify, detain, arrest, and deport, quote unquote, millions of undocumented people from the USA and initiate a massive interior enforcement campaign. While this hasn't happened yet on that scale, it's important to note that while the US is clearing out its immigration detention facilities, deporting tens of thousands of people from the US, and it's dropped its immigration detention population by a third or half, it's also still seeking to increase its immigration detention capacity, including for the purposes of interior enforcement. So with these laws remaining on the books, it's very foreseeable that were the US government to seek to do a massive interior enforcement campaign and expel millions of undocumented people in the US, that all of the communities of faith and other migrant human rights defenders and civil society actors would rise up to protect these communities under siege, such as through the sanctuary movement of the 1980s, would likely themselves become target for these egregious violations of rule of law and the targeting of civil society actors under these spurious human smuggling provisions. So with that, I'll turn it back to Yael, and I'll let her transition over to the film about Scotland. Thank you.
We got, thank you so much, Brian. We got one question, and I get this question sometimes at our other Voices from the Border events, which has to do with how are all of these things, these are so shocking, aren't they a violation of international law? And so if they are, then what is, I guess, the next question. But would you like to, so one person asked, this watch list of human rights defenders is shocking, you know, does it violate international law? Would you like to take that?
Sure, absolutely. So yes, and in this report that we posted a link to, you can, the opening section details both the US and international legal obligations that it violates. I think that usually it's very easy to say that something violates international law because basically all of the Trump administration's border and asylum policies violated international law. But what's important here also is that it violates the US Constitution. It violates the First Amendment, you know, in terms of this targeting of migrant human rights defenders for their work in support of these communities under siege and migrants and asylum seekers on the border. It violates their First Amendment rights in terms of their protected views and speech. It's targeting people based on their political opinions, as well as their efforts to provide advice to these individuals who are under threat. But it also violates equality under the law. It violates DHS's own policies, which actually prohibit it from selectively conducting law enforcement in order to target people based on their protected views and speech. And because of that discriminatory motive, it violates the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution in terms of unlawful search and seizure of individuals, whom it's then seeking to interrogate, search, and criminalize for their humanitarian work based on their protected views of speech. So definitely it violates international law, as well as a host of other aspects, including most importantly the right to life and the prohibition of torture and other ill treatment in the family separations and the ill treatment that people experience in detention through the arbitrary detention of asylum seekers and migrants solely on the basis of their migration status, which is a civil offense. UN special procedures and Amnesty International, among others, have determined that these arbitrary detentions do constitute ill treatment, especially for vulnerable groups of individuals. And in terms of the family separation, both Amnesty International and the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture determined that the deliberateness of the pain that it inflicted in order to deter migrants and asylum seekers rose to the level of torture in many cases. So no question.
Right, so this is a larger conversation, especially about, you know, what to do about so many of these restrictions on the rights of migrants, on the rights of migrant defenders, under international law, under our law, how to hold the government accountable, what activists can do. We've gotten a lot of questions about that in the Q&A. I think the documentary addresses some of these issues, actually, brings some of them to light. So why don't we take a look at that? Rest assured to the audience, I am keeping a notebook full of your questions and we will get to them afterwards. So I'm gonna turn it over to the Refugees International communications folks to get the documentary started, and we will see you after the movie.
To start with, I'd like for you to write down any particular question or thought that you have about the topic at hand for today. Remember, the topic at hand for today is borders, walls, and immigration.
First word was fear. Borders are supposed to keep us safe, and now I have fear.
I'm prejudiced. I come from a city where we didn't have any people of any color till I was about 40. Up in Wisconsin. So, you know, that's the way I was raised.
Thank you for sharing that, yeah. moving through. Yep.
I guess my thing is they want to come here. They want to come here for a better life so badly. But then they also want to say, well, do it my old country way.
Yeah.
You know, I guess I don't understand that.
I'll be real quick. She pretty much stole some of my thunder. I'm sorry. We have the same wavelength. Assimilation is very important.
Hey, thank you. I really appreciate you being here. Yeah, thanks again. Hey, thanks a lot. Appreciate you being here, yeah. So I live in Ajo. I'm a geographer, but another thing that I do is a lot of volunteer work getting water to people who are dying in the desert, searching for people who have become lost and have died in the desert. There's a lot of effort of civilian groups. I was one of them. Yep.
No, in the interest of full disclosure, should have told us about.
Probably should have told you that first. Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Oh, hey, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it, and thanks for your stories. Yeah.
We turn now to southern Arizona, where a humanitarian aid volunteer is heading to trial for providing food, water, and shelter to 2 undocumented migrants. Scott Warren of Ajo, Arizona, faces up to 20 years in prison after being charged with 3 felony counts for allegedly harboring undocumented migrants.
People drink from these migrants as they're crossing through here.
Up into here, it'll be a little bit clearer whether we found a trail or not. I mean, that's the big unknown factor is finding a trail.
These guzzlers are probably key, like, that people would want to get to for water.
Great.
This is Scott talking.
Marco.
Polo. Great. 2-1, they work.
Oh, and do you think that'll go down?
Growing up here in Ajo, we were always taught, whenever you go in the desert, always carry water.
Ajo is the first town you reach when you cross the border.
I hear a lot of stories of people who have died in the desert.
Sometimes there would be people passing through, wanting water.
They ask for a tortilla or a glass of water.
We always just gave it to them. What the hell? Ain't supposed to let nobody die of thirst or starve to death.
Le va a faltar el agua, le va a faltar la comida.
To us, it's normal. We've lived with them all of our lives. That was never a big deal. And then the government stepped in, made a big deal out of it, and now it's a big deal.
Picking up this trash somebody left on the trail. It's not yours, is it? All you have to do is tell me, is it yours?
Scott Warren, No More Deaths, your organization, released a report detailing how U.S. border agents had intentionally destroyed more than 3,000 gallons of water left out for migrants. Explain the significance of this, the timing, the same day.
The report was released that morning, and then agents arrested me that evening. United States of America versus Scott Daniel Warren. On or about January 17, 2018, at or near Ajo, in the District of Arizona, United States Border Patrol agents were conducting surveillance on a building known as the Barn. 2 subjects that matched a description of 2 lost illegal aliens received the address to the barn as a place they could get food and water. After finding their way to the barn, Warren met them outside and gave them food and water for approximately 3 days. It's a scary thing to face these charges, but the 2 men that were arrested with me have not and do not receive the same kind of support and attention that I've been getting. And that's not lost on me either.
Stand up
gather around so you can see the maps, okay? Okay? So you all understand that almost everyone who migrates back and forth across this border migrates through the urban areas of this border, through the cities, because it's the easiest and safest place to cross, right? Except that in 1994, the United States decided for the first time to secure the border. They called it prevention through deterrence. So they said, step one, we believe we can seal off those urban areas from migration. And they said, step two, when that happens, people are going to start to go around the edges, right? But, they said, now when they go around the edges, they will have to go through the deadliest areas of the border. And they said, that will be a deterrent to other people trying to cross, and thereby we will secure the border. Got it? And they were wrong. So this is the result of that strategy. Every one of those red dots is where human remains have been found.
We're going to trial next week, and I'm scared, but this isn't just going away. We're in this. We're in this till the end, whatever the end looks like. There's this water source, and then to the south, like 15 miles out and across the valley, there's another water tank like this. And I think basically why so many people are dying in this area is that they're trying to get to here.
Right.
And they don't make it.
So we can't, at this moment, say exactly what will be prosecuted and exactly what will not be prosecuted. We're in this really interesting moment in history. We're kind of tracking human rights defenders increasingly becoming targeted, intimidated, harassed, and prosecuted by state actors, including the United States.
I have over a dozen illegals. They ask for food. I feed them, I give them water. But my question is, can the Border Patrol go in my yard and get me? Would I be in trouble?
So is it my responsibility as a United States citizen to get identification for every person I give a glass of water to?
Right. Can you not put water on the other side of your fence post or your property line?
Then you're littering and you have misdemeanors.
Then you hang it from your fence on the other side. Is that littering if it's not touching the ground? It's all legal, 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 legal. All these little details.
500 years
of legal. When slavery was legal and slaves were running away and people were helping them, it was probably illegal. In your heart, you know what is right to do for another human being.
I know where my personal decision making and my personal conscience stand with those things. I cannot tell you what the answers are to those questions in terms of the legal framework of the US code or anything like that. Sometimes this doesn't get reported, but there were 3 of us arrested that day. It was me, along with Jose and Christian. The judge released me on my own recognizance after about 24 hours in custody He said, yeah, whatever, you're not the kind of person that we need to put in jail right now. They kept Jose and Christian in detention in order to depose them as material witnesses in the case against me. And then in exchange for that, they very quickly deported them back to the places which they had been fleeing for their lives.
Do we know if those people that were deported back to the countries to which they had been afraid to live in are still alive?
I don't know.
Before, I see somebody on the road, need some water, whatever, here. Now I won't do it because I'm afraid of consequences.
No puedes ayudarle a nadie porque ya estás cometiendo un delito, un crimen. Uno quisiera, pero no se puede.
Everyone says Scott should be innocent.
Yeah, I don't think it was right. He was just helping someone in need.
He broke the law. If you do the crime, you do the time.
Shoe size.
Shoe size? 14 or 13.
Do you have a preference between shiny and not shiny?
Always non-shiny. I'm a matte finish kind of a human being. This could be okay, or like this kind of blue, I like. I feel like the black looks like you're going to a funeral. The navy blue looks like you're getting on a yacht.
This is strategy.
Okay.
It's not for you, but we want you to look sharp for jury selection.
Yeah.
I love you. So I'll see you really early.
All right, so thank you all for coming out today. We're here to stand in solidarity with Dr. Scott Warren and everybody else who believes that water and food are basic human rights.
Have a good day.
Thanks.
Yeah, you got this.
You are doing an impressive job of maintaining your cool.
Thanks.
Humanitarian aid is not a crime. It's not only not a crime, it's a duty, it's a responsibility.
Scott Warren, you go on trial today. Amnesty has called for all charges to be dropped. The judges refused to drop the charges. Scott, are you prepared to spend 20 years in prison?
A federal criminal trial in Tucson is catching national attention. The
trial of an Arizona man began today in federal court.
Warren has pleaded not guilty to the charges.
If he's convicted, he faces
20 years in prison. Reporting in
the
studio.
legal aspect of this case.
As Martin King said, the arc of history is long indeed, but it always bends toward justice. Well, it bends toward justice because people keep pulling on that end of the arc.
Been deliberating for 5 hours, still no verdict. But
when you get to be my age, you understand that it's going to be a lifelong struggle, and you just got to keep bending.
Did you get any feel for this?
So I'm going to speak first as a representative of Scott's legal team. Scott Warren remains innocent because the jury could not unanimously conclude otherwise. The government put on its best case with the full force of countless resources, and 12 jurors could not agree with that case. We remain devoted today.
The trial ended in a hung jury. So there will be another trial, and that will happen in November. You know, you think of places in the world where extreme forms of violence and oppression are used to coerce people into doing things or to not doing things, and they still do them. So the short answer is, I think that people will always provide humanitarian aid, regardless of what the consequences are.
So just a quick point I wanted to make about the documentary, about just two things that were said. And one thing is, in the initial meeting, you know, folks sitting around with Scott Warren talking about how they felt about immigration. You know, one person said, you know, why don't people just come illegally and kind of get online? What we know is that, you know, that's just not really a possibility for most of these people. There is no line really to seek refugee status from Central America. So frequently people are just fleeing, and this is the way they can go, the only way they can leave. And I just wanted to say, I'm a historian by training. It certainly was illegal to help runaway slaves in the 19th century. And so that comment about, and there have been a lot of comparisons drawn by many people, historians of the United States and the social movements themselves, to abolitionism and the fact that, you know, slavery was a law of the land and providing sanctuary to runaway slaves. There are some comparisons that can be drawn to the sanctuary movement of the 1980s, which Brian referenced, and also to no more deaths in the movement today. We have a lot of questions that came in. So one of them has to do with, I think this is most directed to Paige. And the question is about what do you do, because how does Border Patrol sort of respond to No More Deaths aid stations? It seems like they're destroying them, and what do we do about that? You know, what do you do about that problem?
Yeah, so I think they were likely referring to our humanitarian aid station in Arivaca called Bird Camp. In 2017, Border Patrol raided the camp with a warrant and arrested 4 people who had sought out medical care at that station. We are still running it and operating. Because people keep coming there for help, and so we've continued our work there. We've continued dialogue through the years with Border Patrol to kind of attempt to reach agreements about protecting humanitarian aid. We're currently in dialogue with them. It's a kind of tricky process, but we do attempt to maintain dialogue just so we can try to de-escalate situations. We recently got some lawyers put in a Freedom of Information Act request probably over a year ago at this point, about No More Deaths, and we just got a bunch of information back and actually found out that BORTAC, the Border Patrol Tactical Unit, acted in an advisory role for the raid. There were actually agents involved. And also about 4 hours before the raid, the head of the Border Patrol Union sent an email putting pressure on the local sector to raid the station because there'd been surveillance for about 48 hours. And so we're really seeing just a lot of connections between, you know, BORTAC being deployed in Portland, and then also just the role of law enforcement unions, which I think a lot of organizers in like the current Black uprisings have really talked about, of just the power that a lot of these law enforcement unions have. And we just found out, like literally in the past week, we're gonna go public with that information tomorrow. So it was a little secret release, I guess, but we found out that they were involved in the raid on Bird Camp in 2017. But we are still operating that space because people are still going there for help. So we have an obligation to still be there and provide care.
And I just wanted to thank you. I just wanted to say that I think one of the things that the documentary did very effectively, which is a hard thing to do, was show 2 things. One is that the trial or the prosecution of Scott Warren, it was a big trial, but it was mostly to intimidate others. In other words, there was a targeting of one very prominent person to make other people who then said, well, now I'm scared. Now I'm scared to provide humanitarian aid. And what we know a lot about Scott Warren's trial because it was made into that, intimidating, but we don't know what happened to the men he tried to help. And I think, you know, part of the reason for this event is that, you know, I also didn't know what happened to this person, and, you know, the asylum policies, one person raised in the meeting, you know, do we know what happens to the people that the US government expels or deports? We don't know either. So there's a lot of missing people here that we don't know about. One audience member asked specifically about whether or not what kind of outreach efforts would be with local ranchers or others would actually be helpful, and if there is other types of local activism that can be done. I'll ask another question about more national activism that we could do around this, but are there local things that we can do to sort of help people who are missing? I guess that's to Paige as well, maybe to Gia too.
Gia, do you want to start?
Support organizations like ours, like all of ours, honestly. Colibri right now we work actually closely to No More Deaths. We were in large part of the conversations with the sheriffs and BP on that abuse documentation report that I assume is coming out tomorrow. So I'm really happy that's coming because it's so important, because we hear this directly from the families. We hear this directly from them. So if you want to be involved, support our work. Donations, or if you're local, participate in a water drop. I think there's a lot of border tours that happen, and I know they've all been kind of stalled right now at the moment because of COVID, but there's virtual ones as well. But I think that's one of the most intimate and profound ways and transformational ways that you can really learn about our work, going out there. But other than that, educate yourselves as much as possible through reading the various reports that have been brought up today.
One of the audience members asked about how to support your work even remotely. So I assume through your website to learn about it, but if you have any suggestions there too, and Paige, you might also have some.
Yeah, I mean, we offer internships as well. I know that's not probably the ways that people want to get involved, but if that is another way. I think Colibri does very particular work. We're always looking for people who have set skills as well. If you're a forensic anthropologist or studying anthropology, we would love your interest and your skills. We mostly look for people who are bilingual as well, because our work is servicing families. So I can only speak for Colibri. I know No More Deaths, there's a lot more capacity for all different types of volunteers.
Yeah, and we're definitely, with COVID, it's really changed how we've been operating, but we are starting to reopen our local volunteer programs so that people can come on water drops. We've implemented a lot of protocols around it, and so people kind of need to abide by those while they're on a water drop, but also we're asking our volunteers to adhere by pretty strict social distancing in their lives, just because they will be potentially interacting with people who don't have the same access to healthcare. And so, yeah, check our website. We should be posting something soon. And then a lot of our fundraising work can be done remotely. So yeah, reach out to us, check out our website, get our newsletter. Donations are great. I also know there's a lot of other groups that they get less of a platform than us. There's a lot of search and recovery and search and rescue groups that don't get as much airtime. So definitely the Águilas del Desierto, Armadillos del Desierto, they're all doing a lot of the recovery work. So look them up and follow them as well, because they're on the ground every day too.
I think I have 3 more questions. I hope we have time to get to them. One of them is I think more for Stephanie, because it's really about, the remains and issues around that. So 2 questions, related questions. One is there any way we can have a clear legal obligation for localities to actually report deaths? What would we have to do that? And then another one comes from somebody who clearly knows a bit about this process. And it's about sort of how the CBP system to codify migrant deaths sort of contribute to the erasure of them, and how is this system sort of flawed and how might it be fixed? So they're both about this sort of reporting of deaths and how we get information about it.
Sure. So to start with the first one of whether there is a way to make it a legal obligation,
that was actually one of the recommendations in our report. We were asking Border Patrol in the report to create working, at least formal agreements with sheriff's offices to very clearly establish the guidelines, or at least what they would like the sheriff's offices to do once they discover a remains, human remains, whether that would be contacting them, letting them know, simply so they could have it in their records and they could be publishing a more complete picture of what's actually going on at the border. That leads into the second one. And the answer to why that's not happening. It is not entirely clear. I did actually flag it to a contact in the Border Patrol who mentioned that they would probably be reaching out. It was a matter of capacity. So it seems to be a capacity prioritization issue. So hopefully they'll make some headway on that, and we put it up as a recommendation. So hopefully there is some movement towards better communication among different agencies. On the second point of the of whether Border Patrol has a database and whether it contributes to erasure, the short answer is yes. They actually, from what I understand, have two distinct databases. They have one database, which is all of the cases where an individual, if they find human remains, if a Border Patrol agent discovers human remains, it goes into one database of Border Patrol encounters. And then their Missing Migrants program has a more extensive database, which is also trying to include other remains that might have been found by other actors, and where Border Patrol might not be present. And that is to try to have a broader scope of really what is going on in terms of migrant deaths in particular areas. And again, I'm talking pretty specifically about South Texas, and I'm actually talking about the RGB sector. So one particular part of the furthest Border Patrol sector south in South Texas. However, even with that broader database, which is trying to capture more of these deaths, it's not clear if those are the data points that are being published. There's a lot of, there's not much transparency around that. And certainly by putting out, they do publish every year Border Patrol, Southwest Border Patrol deaths on the Border Patrol website. And those numbers are the only official numbers we have border-wide on border deaths. And those are the ones that are used as the definitive numbers, because we don't have other ones other than organizations collecting far more fine-grained detailed data in specific parts of the border. And so I think by publishing these data points that aren't inclusive of all the deaths, it is erasing a large number of deaths that are occurring in these areas.
So a couple of questions people asked about, it's related to the data, but it's also actually related to the other issues we discussed, which is, the international law piece. So is there a role for sort of binational collection of data? Is there a way would sort of like an organization like the IOM be helpful to capture a more international perspective and also facilitate, if there are databases in different countries, to facilitate, more adequate data collection about this, because they wouldn't have, and then the other question, that's first, I guess, for Stephanie, but then the other question would be for Brian, which is about, some asked about, the role beyond international law issues, but the role of, for example, for a human rights defender, could they appeal to help from like the UN, who else might come to the aid of these folks beyond, if they can't, beyond people in the United States or our law, the Constitution, as you rightly mentioned. And I'll just leave a last question for all the panelists, because we're running short on time, which is, if you had sort of one policy you would suggest to sort of reverse the worst about this, if you could suggest one thing that you think would make a change, or one way we could really either make these lost migrants visible, or reverse some of the policy damage that we've been talking about today.
To jump in on the data questions, on the first regarding whether there should be more an international scope, the IOM actually does collect really great data. They have a Missing Migrant database. Their data collection often is by using newspaper articles. They also have direct relationships with different local authorities on the ground that provide them with that information. They're a great resource for
kind of getting a sense of migrant deaths in certain parts of the world. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in looking at data related to this issue, to check them out. We did not use their data in the database that we collected, just because we wanted to go directly to each of the primary sources in each county and go through the files ourselves. But certainly we referenced their data and used it as a way to make sure we weren't missing any cases. The other question of whether there should be binational data collection, one of our recommendations in the report was kind of a dream recommendation, but we really believe that the Border Patrol should be collecting data with their counterpart INM in Mexico to try to get at that issue of migrant drownings in the Rio Grande River. Given that right now Border Patrol is publishing perhaps only half of the total figures, and INM is not the agency on the ground that collects that data right now. That's Protección Civil, Civil Protection, in Tamaulipas and Coahuila. But I do believe that there is an area for greater kind of cross-border collaboration, so we could really have a full picture of what's happening, the full scope of the humanitarian crisis. Should I answer the last question now before handing it over to Brian? Okay, so for me, the policy shift I think you have to go for is you have to create more legal pathways. You have to expand the legal pathways, allow people to come legally. I always say, particularly in regards to metering, but it works in all, in all situations. No one is going to cross a river if they can cross the bridge. And the fact that they can't walk across the bridge pushes people into these desperate situations. And so we need to be focusing. It's great to have prevention. It's great to have recovery. All of these efforts are so critical, but to get to that core, we have to address why this even happens in the first place, and that's a lack of legal pathways.
Thanks so much. So the question, as I understood it, is what other avenues are there to try to seek protection and remedies for abuse by government actors? So I would say there's two main factors, right? There's courts of law and there's international organizations. International organizations who are trying to promote international law are not going to be that effective on US authorities. Nonetheless, the UN special rapporteurs, independent experts, and other expert bodies have actually stepped in and written letters to the US government decrying the targeting of Scott Warren and actually dozens of other migrant human rights defenders. I think it's been limited in terms of its impact, but then also in the Latin American context, a number of migrant human rights defenders who are active on the US-Mexico border have appealed to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is a human rights body of the Organization of American States, which the US is part of. And the commission is actually based here in DC. So there have been a number of contentious hearings calling out the US for its targeting of migrant human rights defenders. Again, I think it's really the chorus of calls on this that are the most effective. And as we saw in Scott's case, where he was actually not found guilty, but there was a hung jury in his first trial, and the government retried him a second time. I think one of the things that really made a big difference, and Paige can add to that too if she wants, was having a strong social movement organized by No More Deaths and the general public in saying, hey, this is just part of border life, is that everyone who lives along the border and all that private land, as Stephanie showed, is used to leaving out water for migrants. It's the right thing to do. It's the human thing to do. And ultimately, he was found innocent, and based in part on his spiritual and religious convictions related to people's right to life and the suffering and loss of life that ensues if people don't get this vital humanitarian aid. So courts of law, international organizations can be helpful, but a broad social movement, I think, is the thing that influences what happens in the courts the most. So stay alert, push back. If you see people getting targeted, stand up and raise your voice.
Can I ask just one question of Brian, because it came up. The one person asked if the law, there's a law criminalizing humanitarian aid, and my understanding is that there's actually not a law criminalizing humanitarian aid. It's a law about smuggling that humanitarian aid. So yeah, so I just wanted you to clarify that, because the person asked, like, how could there be a law criminalizing humanitarian aid? And I think that's not really exactly what's going on here. If you could just clarify.
Yeah, that's right. So it's like different provisions of a big behemoth criminal statute on human smuggling. but it does criminalize free speech because it's criminalizing, inducing, or encouraging people to either come to enter, or to stay in the U.S. contrary to immigration law. And what the Department of Justice has spelled out actually is that means if somebody's stranded on the road in Mexico and you give them a ride, you could be prosecuted for human smuggling, even if they never even try to cross into the country, just because you helped them get to the border. If you leave out water in the desert for them, you can be criminalized for human smuggling, or harboring in the case of Scott for giving somebody necessary medical aid, just because they're saying that incentivizes people to cross the border irregularly. As everybody knows, that's not why refugees leave their countries or migrants leave their countries. It's not to drink water in the desert, obviously. But then, and then finally, then the statutes though that have been used to target these people have also then remained open, so they can be used in any circumstance where it could be saying, hey, by supporting people making asylum claims or after they crossed irregularly or whatever, then you're providing cover for them or something. So these smuggling laws are so open to interpretation, which is one reason that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals found this provision in question in relation to the watch list to be unconstitutional, because it was so overbroad. Unfortunately, now that the Supreme Court has kicked it back, they're going to, in remand of the Ninth Circuit's now going to review whether it's vague, it's also vague. So these things are under review, but as the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals found, the Trump administration has very much indicated its readiness to target lawyers and people giving lay support, whether it's legal, humanitarian, or otherwise, with these completely misused criminal statutes in order to deter their work. And just finally, on that note, as Yael mentioned, that's not just theoretical, that the prosecution of Scott Warren resulted in intimidation of other human rights defenders. I've had human rights defenders in Mexico tell me, after seeing Scott's prosecution, they said, we were afraid to go give water to people who were stuck on this side of the bridge, because if the US government's going to prosecute their own citizens, what will they do to us? So there really is a chilling effect that's in play, which is one of the things that, in my view, makes it unconstitutional.
Okay, we have like 2 minutes. Let me give Paige and Gia those 2 minutes that we remain, and we'll wrap up. So why don't, Gia, you go first, and then Paige, you can get the last word.
This is in regards to the policy change. I would love, there's so much that needs to be done, but I think something pretty urgent that I would love to see, not within my lifetime, but even shorter than that. I plan to be a very old woman if I can, is to end prevention through deterrence. Absolutely, and immediately. And other policies like it, like Operation Streamline.
Very clear and to the point. Thank you, Gia. Paige, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I think prevention through deterrence and demilitarizing the border. I think Scott was prosecuted under 1325, which is part of the smuggling statute, or he was 1324, pardon. But 1325 is the statute that criminalizes actually crossing the border and migrating. And I think if we were able to repeal that and decriminalize migration, I think that would also make a big difference.
I want to thank everybody here on the panel. We ran over because there were just so many questions, and there were a lot of people I know, other questions, who really want to reach out to Colibri, to Amnesty, and to No More Deaths, and learn more about Stephanie's research. So I urge all the panelists to, I urge all the audience members to sort of go to the websites of all the organizations and read some of the reports, and that's the best way you can reach out to them to find out how you can help and what you can do. Thanks again to everybody for participating, and look forward to seeing you at our next Voices from the Border event.